Greetings, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of Politics as Usual. I always say it like that, by the way, because of the Jay-Z song. I think this is the last episode I'm going to introduce that. Y'all should know that by now. Anyway, your host, Fred Curtis. I guess I call myself a political strategist and writer, and I don't know, maybe aspiring media mogul. We'll see how that goes. Special guest every time on this show, because that's the impetus of it. This week we have one of the best young men I know. The wonderful, the immaculate, the majestic, I guess, aspiring journalist, Oliver Sandreuter, political organizer, all that good stuff. Oliver, did I gas you up enough in that intro?
I think yeah, definitely.
Okay.
That's probably even more than I need already.
Hey, all right, good. You gotta make sure, man. That's my job. I feel like it's my job, gas people up. Just to frame a few things before we get started. So, Oliver and I had the pleasure, of working together. I guess not last summer, but the summer before last. Time flies, and yet this year has been long at the same time. With Organizing Core, introduced that in an episode previously, but it was an extension of the Democratic National Committee, basically a training program to help recruit local organizers and train them to work on the general election, which is what Oliver did this past year and is still doing. And I know there are a lot of thoughts there that we'll get into, but I'm cliche because I think you get a lot out of people when you ask this question. And so, Oliver, man, just tell us a little bit about yourself.
Definitely. Yeah. So I'm a young guy from the suburbs of Metro Atlanta, from Roswell, Georgia, and grew up here in a extremely kind of privileged, sheltered environment up in the suburbs. Very traditional life up here, just trying to figure out where I fell into the world. I was battling a lot of narratives that have been kind of set out for me and trying to find my own path amidst that. So definitely was a journey throughout my upbringing, through middle school, high school, and everything, moving through the suburbs here in Roswell. Went to school in Nashville, Tennessee, so was staying in the Southeast for my university experience. Had the privilege and good fortune of being able to travel a decent bit throughout those experiences and kind of separate myself a bit from the bubble that I had grown up in, which I'm sure are some experiences we'll jump into later. But throughout those journeys, I was becoming increasingly involved politically. It was looking at largely through the lens of education. Was kind of my background. I've been studying education, working a bit in education, and that is what drew me to organizing. I eventually got into electoral organizing, which is, as you mentioned, where I was extremely lucky to meet the Fred Curtis. Very much changed my life, my trajectory. A big part of why I'm here where I'm at right now. And as you mentioned, I got involved in electoral politics and I'm organizing in there still right now. Wasn't entirely sure if I'd still be here in December and January doing this work, but that is where I'm at. And I'm not entirely sure where we're going, but we'll figure that out. So that's a bit about me, and yeah, I'm excited to be on the pod. Been a big fan of what you got going here with Relentless Love and all the amazing content y'all are putting out. So just feel honored to be a part of it. So thanks, man.
Yeah, no, man. Well, I appreciate it. And I probably can't put into words, what you and so many other folks I uh, had the pleasure of working with the summer before mean to me. I say it all the time, still mean it. Professional honor of my life. Maybe I'll be president one day and that'll take it over, but I don't really foresee that happening. So much I want to sort of dive into here. And I guess we'll start with where you're at now. I totally understand there is, there's a line to toe. And I always, sort of, I tried to, obviously impart this in you all as well, right? Like, yes, you can criticize your employer, but there's a certain limit to it while you're there. So I do want to, name that and let you know, I definitely respect that. But in terms of, just not just the general election, but we got two Senate seats that are open in Georgia at the time of this recording. Just what has that experience been like, and sort of both positives and negatives? How have things maybe changed from November 3rd to now as we gear up for that special election on January 5th?
Definitely. I think that unfortunately, this is not, unique to one specific employer. And so I don't feel too out of line with much of my criticism towards the process itself. But starting first, like on a positive note, at least if we're looking at the time period between November 3rd to now and how that kind of affects the electoral side of things heading into January 5th, it's been incredible just to see the country finally kind of put Georgia on its radar, put Southern politics on its radar in a way that has been on many, many, activists, organizers, and folks from the South and outside of it on their agenda for a long time. But I think in terms of the national eye, when you're looking at establishment politics, when you're looking at the general narrative in this country, has been extremely slow to catch up to what's been going on in Georgia for a long time, what's been going on in the South for a hell of a long time. And so, I guess on a positive note, it's been nice to see that finally, see people being like, oh my God, like Georgia turned blue in the general, and everyone from Georgia being like, yeah, it's been blue, man. Like
Right.
it's been blue. Like it may be blue on the CNN map now, but it's been blue. And so I think that's been really encouraging, and just thinking about hopefully what that will mean in the future towards the way we approach Southern electoral politics, the way we give respect where it's due, where it's been earned for a long time, to so many of the folks that paved the way for this to happen, to get to that national stage. I think that's been a big positive. I think on a local front too, it's been real cool since November 3rd. I was out ballot curing and working through November 4th, 5th, and in the subsequent days, just being out in the community doing a couple more logistical works around those ballots and everything, and just being in the community and seeing so many people just excited in a way that I had never really seen before, and feeling that maybe their vote does matter. Maybe this process isn't totally leaving them out to dry. I mean, it's still, obviously we have an endless amount of work that still needs to be done, and far from where we need to be. But just seeing that hope, and seeing so many people that again have been having their votes suppressed, having their voices forcefully silenced for so long, feel that a little bit of that voice got through, has been really cool, and I'm really optimistic and happy about that, and just the effect that it will have, like I said, throughout communities in Georgia and in the South. And then the outpour of support in the across country in terms of folks phone banking into Georgia, texting into Georgia, friends hitting you up from random states being like, hey, I might come down and knock doors. It's been cool. But I think on the flip side of the coin, calling a spade and being real with it too, from from at least the work side, and realizing how this all works, in the sense that November 3rd comes, again, we get this national spotlight, we get this hype, this media, and everyone all of a sudden knows the name of the state of Georgia. And with that comes everyone wanting to lead their 2 cents in, put their efforts in, which is fine. But I think it speaks to a larger issue within organizing, not just electoral, but when folks come in, they see a cause, they see a movement really gaining traction, which is good. But with that comes that attention of folks that then think that they can bring their expertise and take over, that movement, take over where this is going, start guiding the ship in a way that I think is not always honoring, the communities and the folks that got it to where it needs to be and will bring it to where it needs to go. So I think that's been an interesting thing to observe just between November and heading into January now, about like whose voices do we put forward, do we strengthen, do we embolden when we're given resource, when we're given opportunity, and how much of that energy can be intentionally or oftentimes just more subtly co-opted by the forces of power that have been around for a long time, and that exist just as much in Democratic electoral politics as they do in Republican electoral politics, as they do elsewhere in this country and elsewhere in the world. So that's definitely, I guess, I know it's relatively arbitrary and abstract, but at least, for now, I think I would just say that it has also been an opportunity to really be evaluating, where we place those resources and capacity when those fights begin to get won, and how sustainable that is. if we're looking into trying to build a movement that lasts beyond January 5th,
Yeah.
because this work needs to be done long after January 5th. So I'm not sure if we're always thinking that far ahead.
Yeah. I mean, I'm glad you put it that way. We're not always thinking that far ahead. And my goal is, even not just my goal, I think it's the goal of a lot of people to ensure that like our organizing spaces become things that are indefinite and long term and not just things that last for 4 or 5 months and then you recycle people and start the whole process of training and recruiting and all that other stuff. Mostly, just from a fiscal standpoint, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense monetarily what we do, to be totally honest. But that's a different conversation. You mentioned a lot there. I want to pull out, and I think it was the first part about finally, like Southern politics and the South in general starting to get the due credit and sort of the attention from an organizing standpoint that it deserves, because there's always been a lot of great work going on there, dating back to abolition to, civil rights movements, so on and so forth. You were one of the few white males we have within our organizing cohort. We just don't have as many as I think we should in democratic politics. Sort of different conversation, but I'll leave that there, and it's for a variety of reasons. And I don't think that is because there aren't a lot of folks like you who want to get into it. But Republicans have dominated support amongst white males since pretty much 1965. What I guess what made you want to dedicate to organizing on behalf of Democrats and other, left leaning causes? Was it family? Was it, upbringing? Was it experiences? Like, I mean, because statistically, not that you should be working for Donald Trump, but maybe Mitt Romney or John Kasich, which is, fine. So just curious, what led you to sort of this path with this party rather than something else?
Yeah, no, I think it's a really important question and one that I'm still, unpacking and thinking through myself, and probably always will be. But it's funny that you mentioned that. I remember I've knocked quite a lot of doors in my day, and knocking doors around here. I remember I would have folks answer the door and be like, "No, we're not voting Republican. Like, go away." And
Oh, wow.
I'd be like, "Whoa, whoa, whoa." I'm, I'm trying to see if you're willing to volunteer for,
Sheesh.
a local Democratic candidate for state house or what have you. So I think though that when I think about, like how I got to the work and how I'm continuing to hopefully move through the work, is it's important to look at why, white men in particular have been so deeply involved in the Republican Party, but also just why there are so few, people from my background, which I had mentioned earlier, um, in equity and justice driven work. And I want to pause too, real quick, and just say that I'm well aware that there are quite a lot of people from my background in democratic politics and in politics at large. But again, that being a politician working in politics, even democratic politics, does not mean that you are in
Mhm.
justice oriented work. And I think that, when you look at least as I've moved through my own journey and looking back at how, life is structured in such a way that makes it so that white men, particularly white men from even additional privilege of growing up in wealthy communities like I did and have, are growing up in a world that very much maintains, those narratives that keep folks doing the work that has built these power systems and built these structures, and so that they are not even really aware of like how that work contributes and is essential to the maintenance of those power imbalances and of those inequities. And so I think when I look at like how I got here, it's definitely been a journey in the sense that going, like I was mentioning earlier, going throughout high school, I always felt that internal disconnect of the community in terms of my insular community, and how I didn't feel like I aligned with it in terms of the Republican politics that were around me, because that was in my house. That was certainly in my schools and my communities that I was a part of. But not really knowing what to do about it. Again, just kind of feeling that I was just on this preset path. And I think there are a lot of folks from my background who feel that way, and then just kind of continue that slow burn of just being in those spaces without really criticizing themselves, criticizing their role in that, and thinking critically about what to do about it. So when I wrapped up high school, I was spent some time traveling and outside of my home context, which was really important for me. I had ultimately, I'm only here because of the educators and the mentors that pushed me and really forced me to look at the bubble of life that I had come from and that I'd been living in, and think about what that bubble looks like in the grand scheme of the world that I'm living in truly, and if I feel that that's something that I'm okay with, that I'm comfortable with, and that that's where I want to be. And yeah, that's been an ongoing process. Again, that year before heading into university was essential for me. My time at university, I think for me, it wasn't one pivotal moment, because even after that long period of learning and unlearning, still went through university, the first couple of years at least, with an intention of just taking a classic kind of white collar, white dude job, and thought that maybe like the political involvement and the engagement with my community would kind of be stuff on the side, which I think is again a very common narrative for people from my background. It's like, okay, I'll do my 9 to 5 that is quite literally upholding and strengthening these systems of oppression, but I'm a volunteer for maybe an hour a week, or I'll
Yeah.
do this and kind of scratch that itch, feel good about myself, post it on social media. Um, and, and so that was still very much me. So, we're laughing about it, but I'm laughing at myself. And so then anyways, a little further into my university experience, I was able to study human rights and social movements. Also was traveling throughout the global South for that, with our kind of pedagogy rooted though in the American South and movement building here. And so just being able to draw the connections between these coalitions and the solidarity that was going on between all these different activist communities really began to help me connect the dots with, like, okay, how do I align, my larger way of living, both my professional, my personal, and just my emotional and mental well-being with, these causes, these systems of work that I align with now. And so it wasn't until then that I really decided. I had already, like, at that point, I'd already signed like an offer to go work at some bajillionaire consulting company, and that was still my life. And it wasn't until then that I decided to kind of finally wake up a bit. And that was pretty much right before I ended up getting to meet you, and starting kind of a late start in that journey, but a journey that's been extremely rewarding ever since and will continue to be. So that's kind of, I know I rambled around a little bit there, but that's how I ended up, getting my feet wet in electoral organizing, which then has quickly escalated to, more community driven organizing, and trying to extend beyond just the electoral side of things, which I have my own issues with. And that's kind of where I'm at now, and hopefully will be again a huge part of where I continue to be. And so, but yeah, I think again, going back to why folks from my background rarely end up in this work, I think it's very intentionally, built that way to maintain itself. And few folks are fortunate enough to have the mentors, the educators, and the environments that really helped me along the way. So I don't know if that answers the question, but I think
Oh
it's a
yeah,
really
more than answers it. And don't be afraid to ramble. There's a lot of good education and tidbits within there. One of the things I want to highlight is you mentioned obviously a lot of your travels, and sort of how a lot of that was looked at through the lens of the American South. And in some ways, you mentioned growing up in the suburbs of Metro Atlanta, going to college in Nashville. One of the things I have most pride in is actually being from the South. And just some of the culture and just things I've learned as, by way of being a Southerner. I guess I would ask you particularly because you've got some valuable experience within the lens of international travel and movement and organization building. Are there any Southern specific sort of cultural organizing trends that you sort of saw bear out in your international travels? And if so, like just what were some of those, and what did you learn from seeing those things outside of not just America but the American South?
definitely. And I think that, yeah, that was just, that has been such an essential part of giving more context and encouragement to my work in a local context, because particularly as I was mentioning when I was beginning a lot of those studies in human rights and international social movements. Having it was a bit of a formalized program, and it intentionally began in Atlanta.
Mm.
And then we went to the Highlander Center in Tennessee, which is this amazing place of activism and education, and solidarity movements. And so, really being rooted, having that program rooted there, which I was from the American South, but a lot of folks on this program were students from other parts of the world, other parts of the country. And the choice to, again, have this entire program around social movement, around justice work rooted in the American South before then, traveling across a variety of spots in the global South, was really foundational to recognizing a lot of these trends and cultural, uh, values that were showing up in different justice oriented work elsewhere. I think one thing that really stood out to me, growing up in the suburbs of the South, and particularly the white suburbs of the South, for me, my religious community and my faith community looked very different than, the legacy of faith-based communities in activism in the South. And I think it's really common for some folks to kind of take this, especially in leftist work and left-oriented work, a really critical view towards religion, right? And you kind of write off religion and like, oh, like maybe I'm spiritual, maybe I'm a faith-based person, but organized religion, that's the worst. I think that's a really common thing. And I was at the time really kind of grappling with that because I had seen a lot of good and a lot of bad done in the name of religion. And one thing that was really powerful to see was the concept of liberation theology, and the reinterpretation of text, of scripture, of religion in a way that, at least in my opinion, and in the voices of the educators that were sharing information with me, just really brings back the true purpose of religion and of spiritual work, which is liberation, right? And freedom and an equity-based perspective in everything that goes on through religion. And so having that, being done in the South, and then seeing it being done elsewhere in the world through a variety of different religions, potentially, and different scriptures and whatnot. But so many of those activists still referencing the American South, and so much of that work that had been kind of pioneered in the American South was really, really cool. Just to see how faith and religion can be such an essential component of really radical work being done all across the world, with reference to the American South. Also, while we were traveling in some of these spots, I had a really good friend of mine who was centering her research on how hip hop and rap from the American South was such a key component to radical movement. And it was just insanely cool to be kind of a fly on the wall with her as she would go meet up with these, spoken word poets, these rappers, these, people doing freestyle on the streets in languages sometimes that we didn't even understand, and we would have like an interpreter with us and whatnot, and just be hanging out with people and seeing, again, like just the impact that that rap and that hip hop music in general, spoken word poetry, was having all across the world. And again, just having so much of these trends be rooted in the American South, and these activists being like, oh yeah, like, we know it's good. We know what's going on over there. We think it's the coolest thing. It's given us a lot of cool, perspective and added value to our work. And a lot of that dialogue going both ways, a lot of those communities being connected with one another was super cool. And so I think that those are a few things that were really standing out to me, and just realizing again how much true like solidarity and coalition was in all that work, and made it so I was like, oh wait, this isn't just like a fight or a struggle going on in Nepal, and this isn't just a fight or a struggle going on with the Chileans, like, fighting for economic equity and fighting against the privatization of their water. It's like, no, like all this has such deeply common threads. And some of those, whether it was liberation theology, hip hop, or whatever else, that kind of made those ties more clear. But it was definitely a common trend throughout it. But mind you, too, I want to be real with it. Like that's going on in a lot of these, organizing communities and whatnot. But also the surface level kind of stereotypes of the U.S. South are still very much real, in all different parts of the world. And also if you're just traveling around the US, like we were kind of
Yeah.
mentioning earlier, and how deeply misunderstood like activist work and in general, like the politics of the South are understood elsewhere. And that's very intentionally created. You guys have already talked about this on this show quite a lot, with, how, you got Dr. Martin Luther King, who's, just this nice little bow and wrap figure who's, a nice pacifist and, did this one thing and we're done with it. It's in the past.
Yeah.
And, and how all these narratives are really intentionally built up. So I know that's a whole another conversation that y'all, like I said, touched on a decent bit already on this pod. So, but yeah, that all obviously still very much exists, but it was really cool to see all those other through lines, between the work in other places and here.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's a conversation that never gets old. Just, how we try to, um, I guess, paint history and historical figures in one light and ignore everything else. Martin Luther King can be a whole series and how we've done that, and maybe I'll have time to get to it. So much to sort of pull out there, so many insights. I think the biggest thing I would say, actually, Oliver wrote a book. If you're watching this on YouTube or whatever, Bridging the Gap. Incorporating travel into education, work, and a meaningful life. So go get that on Amazon. But you recently wrote a book, obviously, where you focus on travel, and sort of how it plays, an instrumental role in personal and sort of professional development. And, this is actually one of the things that a lot of, quote unquote, prominent voices and movements have in common. People forget, Dr. King, went to school in Pennsylvania and traveled to a host of international places. We can go down the list with a lot of different organizers. Obama was, so on and so forth. Won't get into the details, but I guess within the context of organizing, why do you think travel can be such an instrumental thing to do or process or thing to experience when it comes to coalition building, community building, so on and so forth? Why do you think that is?
Definitely. I think that for me too, what I would say on travel is that at least I feel that travel is very loosely defined. I think a lot of people think of travel as like, hopping on a flight and going on vacation somewhere, and that's what travel is, and that's obviously can be travel, I suppose, but to me, it's more what constitutes travel is any sort of experience or even just an encounter that brings you out of the immediate reality that you're in and kind of lets you look at that from 10 steps back
Mm,
and just learn more about it from a different lens. And that can be thousands of miles, that can be thousands of feet, into an
yeah.
environment that you otherwise would not have been in, and that you intentionally place yourself in. And so I think in the context of organizing that process of, I think I know, obviously on this podcast and in Relentless Love, so many folks are rooted in organizing and rooted in community organizing. So I certainly think that people can relate to feeling just so busy, so present, so caught up in what you're doing, what the day to day looks like. Um, that there's always work to be done, which is true. But I think that process of, again, stepping out of the immediacy of the work to learn from the way other communities are fighting similar fights, and that, again, like this struggle is going on so many places, right? It's not
Mm,
just whatever it looks like in the localized context that we may be in at the time. And so, yeah, like being in those different spaces and learning how different organizers are using different strategies to combat very similar systems of oppression, but maybe through different ways, different cultural contexts, and different ways of building coalition and solidarity is really valuable, I think, for organizers who, want to find ways to, again, when you need that mental health of feeling that like the world is, there's so many other people having this fight,
mm,
having, good days, bad days, having different strategies that you otherwise might not have thought of and that you can learn a lot from, that you can share with them as well, what your struggles look like and what your victories are looking like. And it's just that I think it's really brings a lot of hope and brings a lot of connection, and again, that solidarity of feeling like you've got support and that you're supporting people outside of your localized context. I think that kind of classic cliche, right, of think globally, act locally, or whatever. And I think that's,
Yeah.
as it's very cliche-y, but I do think that having that additional connection with work and movements being done elsewhere is super valuable. And the best way to do it is to go get involved with that work, and to make those relationships, make those friends, and you know, have it be something more than just words on a page. And yeah, so I think that within the organizing context is a huge value of travel, and can really bring a lot of subsequent value to the way the day to day looks like in the organizing world.
Yeah, I love the explicit rejection of the rigid definition of travel. And then now there are a lot of ways to incorporate that into one's life. What I've learned in sort of being a writer and writing two what I think are very mediocre books is you learn a lot more so as a writer than I think what you intend on conveying to others. What did you learn personally while writing the book?
I'm definitely going to flip this question back on you in a second. But I guess for me, I feel like I definitely learned a hell of a lot in the process. And I think one just overarching thing that I learned is just to be asking people for their stories.
Mm,
Be asking and listening as much as possible for these stories, because I was it never ceased to amaze me how much people are sitting on, how much
yeah.
value and story and just incredible things you can hear from folks when you just ask and you just take the time to listen, really, without much of a goal. When I began writing the book, I really didn't have much of an idea of what it was going to be or what the purpose of it was. I just wanted an excuse to reach out to people that had looked like they had been through formative experiences and talk about that. And I just think that has really given me a lot of encouragement in my organizing to similarly, again, just like hear people's stories and have that rooted in that relational kind of organizing, and always be intentional about seeking that out. So I feel like I really continue to try to incorporate that into what I do. And another thing, I feel like the second thing I'd say is just a tremendous amount of respect for
Mm,
creators, for artists, for musicians, for writers, for poets, who put their work out there. I think, like, for me, like, I'm incredibly just anxious and self-conscious about anything I'm putting out. And through the process of writing, I just remember being incredibly hard on myself, the classic kind of perfectionist tendencies
yeah.
of realizing, though, that it's not that I need more time to make this perfect. And if I'd only had more time to write this sentence or this chapter, it's like, no, it's not perfect. And
Yeah.
it's not perfect because I'm not perfect.
Mm,
And there are a lot of very, I need to stop worrying about whether people will critique this work, because they will and they should. And it has flaws, and I have quite a lot of flaws. And I was just putting out, a relatively general book about travel, and again, wasn't really pouring, trying to, but I wasn't pouring nearly as much of my emotion and myself into my work as so many creators and artists and poets do. And so I feel like I just, continue to learn more and more respect for that kind of cathartic process of content creation and sharing it, and how much value can be found if you're being honest in that process, which is why, I think as I was writing and I was going through that process, some of the things that you shared with me about your own process of writing, and now having written multiple books and put out so much content, I'd be really curious, and which anyone who doesn't already have these books, make sure you go buy them, particularly Not Okay. Thanks for asking. It's just an incredibly beautiful piece of work that is just so raw with emotion, but also so wonderfully, like, refined, and the prose and the music incorporated in there. It's just, I was amazed with that piece, man. So I really appreciate you putting that out there. Anyone who doesn't have it already, pause the podcast right now,
I
go to your
appreciate it.
go to the cart, add it, go grab that for sure. But yeah, man, I'd love to hear a little bit about what you feel like you've learned in the process now of being putting out amazing content for a very long time.
Yeah, well, thank you. Yeah, I'm not gonna be one of those people that's like, oh, I don't deserve that. Every time somebody tells you your art is good, artists appreciate it. So, thank you. I think the biggest thing I've learned is that one, there are definitely still insecurities in me. Every time I put out anything new, but especially books, it's like there's always that little voice in my head or feeling of like, this is inadequate. This isn't good enough. Maybe you shouldn't have done this. Maybe you shouldn't have put this out. Um, and I think honestly, writing the poetry book in sort of the last honestly 3 or 4 weeks or so, that feeling's been pretty tangible. For a variety of reasons. One of them is sort of practical. Couldn't quite afford an editor, so you edit everything yourself. And I look at it, and I'm like, man, first 10 pages, I catch 3 errors. The perfectionist in me is mad. You
I
know.
read it. I read it. I didn't catch anything. I was so
No, I appreciate that. It wasn't too bad. But then the other one is, within the book, it goes back honestly to a lot of stuff we talked about as far as just, religion and reconciling some of those things is, there was a part of me that wanted to tone a lot of things down or take it out or maybe not be as raw. And, one of them, to be, totally honest, is the book is relatively sensual, and I think I needed to tell those stories in their most raw form because one, there are so many people who identify and struggle with that in some capacity. But two, I think growing up in the South, particularly, I mean, it could be other places, but just from a Southern perspective, is so much of what you're taught growing up suppresses such a huge part of what we know is just a part of the human experience, especially as you're growing from childhood to teenagers to adolescence to so on and so forth. And the ways in which we refuse to create space for even young adults to explore that, I think it's troublesome. I think it's dangerous in a lot of ways. And so that was one of the main reasons I felt like those stories needed to be told in their most pure form. But to wrap it all up, I think the thing I learned the most in writing that is that uh, tr- trauma is more lasting than we like to admit. um, on the flip side of that, though, I think what it made me do is really reconcile a lot of things I had never reconciled, confront them in ways I had never confronted them, and attempt to package it in a way that one speaks to um, a lot of experiences that people have also had, and then two also creates environments and references that potentially help them sort of process it as well. I actually had somebody reach out to me like, "Oh, this is a whole new um, genre," and that felt, good in the context of that. Like, I want to encourage people and inspire them to like create art that doesn't have bounds. Like I had thought about trying to get somebody else to publish that, and maybe I did myself a disservice, but I was just like, I don't see anybody publishing this. It's not going to go within the realms of what we expect or think poetry to be. So I can go on and on about what I learned and what I'm still learning about having, written that. Because I'm sure, as you know, there's the process of writing it and what you learn. There's a process of it being just out and what you learn too. And like I haven't read the whole thing since I published it. I kind of don't have a desire to be honest. But you still kind of keep learning. I think once your art is out there, and that's one of the things I've learned the most, in that process. I don't know if
yeah.
that answers your question, but
No, it's your question. I think you answered it wonderfully. No.
I appreciate you throwing it back at me. That's good. That's good. Um, uh, Shifting gears a little bit. Um, Well, actually, no. Let's stay on the sort of topic of the South. If the Midwest is the heartland of the country, the South is what?
That's a good question. Um, I think I would say, and just the soul of the country.
Mm,
And I think the reason I say that is because, to me at least, the South holds so much of the like what makes this country so beautiful, what makes people so beautiful, but also what makes this country so terrifying, and what makes people and the world we're living in so terrifying. And I think, to me, that's what a soul is really all about. Like it holds the truth, and I think that that's, to me, what the South really holds. And to make progress as a body, you have to dive deep into the soul. I think you got to understand it, you got to learn about it, you got to be in it, you got to unpack so much of deep historical, things that make it what it is. So it's so tied with the legacy of everything around it, and
Mhm.
everyone that's been through it. That yeah, that to me, that is really uh, what I think the South is really all about. And without it, we we don't have much.
Yeah.
And it will exist long before whatever the physical nature of the South ceases to exist or continues to exist, or what have you. And it's deeply connected with the spiritual, with the heavens, whatever,
Mhm.
however you so choose to define that. um, and it can exist far outside the physical boundaries of the American South. I think that soul can be in a lot of places. I've seen it in a lot of places. um, and so I don't know. I think maybe that's how I'd answer that question. I don't know if you have any opinions or takes
Yeah,
on it
yeah,
too.
no, I would agree. I think there's I mean, you know me, I've got an incredible fondness, appreciation, love for the South. I think not every, but most movements you see here, even once you include sort of, Native Americans and sort of their push for some recognition, some restitution for all the atrocities America has done to them as well. Like, when you mention spirituality, I think about that as well, not just so much like Christian faith and Black liberation, but also like the land there still being sacred, even though people were unjustly pushed away from there. So no, I would absolutely agree with the South being the soul of the country. Um, Couple more questions here before we close out. Shifting a little bit back to electoral politics. I was watching because I'm weird, I do this. I was watching the second night of the 1980 Republican National Convention. Don't ask me why I was watching that.
Very
Um,
impressive.
and I was watching Barry Goldwater give a speech. Goldwater published, I think, The Conscience of a Conservative in 1960. Um, Reagan gave his famous sort of political launching speech, A Time for Choosing, in 1960. I've long argued that the Democrats need a Ronald Reagan and they need a Lee Atwater, someone who comes and sort of redefines what it means to what we mean as a country, and who can easily communicate that in a way as succinct and clear as him, regardless of whether arguments hold up to logical fallacies. Right, the guy was an amazing politician. Um, but what Goldwater sort of drew out from that speech, the thing that sticks with me is towards the end, talks about sort of party unity and how, Republicans aren't perfect. Our party isn't perfect, but it's my party. I support it. That's one of the things I've long struggled with when it comes to Democrats is this unnecessary, unrealistic purity test. And I think a part of that, honestly, is why we struggle to win elections so much, unfortunately. What's your advice? Somebody who's worked in Democratic politics, who has the context of organizing and movement building that you do. What's your advice to those who think Democratic candidates need to be perfect?
Yeah, I think that's really, it's quite real, and I definitely agree. And you and I have talked about this, and I know you've talked about it on the podcast before as well. Just that this purity standard is incredibly harmful to, like, focusing on the larger goal and focusing about where we're trying to get to, and that in that process there's going to be an incredible amount of imperfection and missteps. But if we're not pushing and we're not moving forward, then that ground is being gained elsewhere by other folks who have even more harmful ideologies and things that they're trying to push on to folks whose lives are deeply impacted by that in the interim. And while we're debating purity, while we're debating this and that, as political strategists, as activists, as organizers, all of our lives and are being impacted on a very real way on a very everyday basis.
Mhm.
Uh, but I do think, though, that it's always valuable to be having that conversation as long as the work is being done.
Mhm.
And I think too often we get lost in that conversation, and we feel that if we spend about 2 hours bantering back and forth, whether it's on social media or whether it's just with your friend, that you've kind of checked your political, checkbox for the day. You've engaged, right? And if you're not doing the real work, if you're not involved and engaged in your local community and in the causes and the context that you care, it's not going to do you any good to be coming to your own conclusion, whatever it is about, the certain standards of a candidate or what have you. But I also, yeah, I think that in terms of where the Democratic Party needs to go as well. I think that if the Democratic Party wants to continue to say that it's this party of the working class, of single moms, of immigrant families, and put out all these real nice ads, every couple of years that really hype it up, and then run candidates that aren't that,
Mhm.
then you also deserve to be incredibly criticized and disengaged with, and people getting frustrated and not showing up, and that's what you're going to get if you keep acting the way that the party has acted for pretty much since it's been around.
Yeah.
And so, while I do think on an individual, on an organizer level, focusing on the work, making sure you're doing the work and holding those dialogues at the same time is important. I think that the party needs to finally at some point put its money where its mouth is and
Mhm.
actually support the candidates that it claims as a party to support. And without that, I think that it's going to continue to hemorrhage votes and hemorrhage support, because people, I do think, are justified in holding the party to that purity standard if it's going to continue to claim that it is that standard and that it's doing work in the name of that standard, when it clearly is not in terms of an establishment level. It's not putting its money there, and it's not putting its resources with those communities, with those candidates. That obviously we have so many examples of in 2020 and 2018 and 2016 and long before that.
Yeah.
So I don't know. I think it's obviously a complicated topic that I don't feel remotely qualified to fully address or answer, but that's, I would say, more or less my 2 cents on it. And for everyone, having those critiques and running things by the purity test, keep doing that.
Mhm.
Keep running. Keep that movement, keep that activism rooted in an ideal, in everything that we want to accomplish, but don't let that get in the way of us doing the work, that we need to do to get there, because
Mhm.
you're not just going to wake up that way. And a lot of that stuff won't even be accomplished in certainly any near future, without, a really, obviously, a credible amount of work that needs to get done in the meantime.
Yeah. Yeah. Speaking of the work, what's next in your organizing journey?
Yeah, so I think for me, I will be leaving the side of electoral organizing probably for a little bit. Who knows? Maybe I'll come back. And I
Yeah.
know, Stacy hopefully will be on the ballot in a couple of years. So,
So.
yeah, honor and privilege to work for her. But for me, I'm going to be teaching. Soon we
Mm.
go back to education. Like I said, that's kind of where my roots come from. And I'm excited just to be in the classroom, in a sustainable form of organizing, I
Mm.
think. And I don't mean that in the sense, oh, the work is, as an organizer, is not sustainable, the hours are too long. I don't mean it that way. I mean, embedding yourself in a way that allows the structures in play allow you to be in a place and sustainably part of a community, and connected in that way. So I'm looking forward to teaching, being in the classroom. I'm working right now too with an organization that we're developing some curriculum for social change. Essentially, it's helping create content for educators to share, hard-hitting topics and honest topics that rarely get touched on in kind of our traditional public school curriculums, but finding ways to incorporate that into, the structures that all public school teachers, that we all have to, play with and play to. So yeah, I think that for me, again, like having so much of my own experience rooted in my educational journey of the learning and the unlearning, more specifically, that had to be done and continues to be done. That's just kind of a space that, when it comes to my organizing, that I feel like I want to be rooted in. And then obviously we'll just continue to find as many communities and as many causes and work that I get asked to join, and asked to put my work towards. I think that as long as I'm positioning myself that I'm clearly available to help and do work, then that's where I kind of want to be. So I'll just wherever needs me.
Yeah. Well, no, we appreciate it. And if I'm ever able to get any portion of the band back together, you'll be the first call. Let's close with a rapid fire. Favorite place you've traveled?
um, it's always a tough question. I think every place is different, but Favorite like recent place that I was in Cuba, which I just
Hmm.
felt like I was just learning an incredible amount, just absorbing the world in a way that I otherwise never would have really been able to see. So that I don't know if that would be a quick answer. Sorry.
Yeah, no worries. Hot or iced coffee?
Hot.
Yeah, I don't understand how people do iced coffee. No offense to you,
Yeah,
iced
my
coffee
partner
people.
does iced coffee, and I just not my thing.
Favorite book?
Oh.
You can do top three.
Okay. One of my favorite, I really like One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. Ken Kesey, great, just commentary about power. Recently, a couple books I've read that I keep hyping up to all my friends and family. N.K. Jemisin, the Broken Earth trilogy. It's a fantasy trilogy. If you don't read fantasy, no, I feel you, but just give these a try. This woman just builds worlds in a way that is so incredible and has so many ties of social justice, social work in there as well, and it's just an incredibly enjoyable read too. If you're looking for just an awesome read. And then what else have I read recently that I really liked? I read a book called Minor Characters that I would recommend too. It's a memoir of Joyce Johnson in the time of the Beat era, the 1950s. She's a white woman and just was kind of around Jack Kerouac. And I think that the book kind of On the Road has gotten quite a lot of, a lot of people read that. A lot of people think about like these kind of the Jack Kerouac kind of character in that time period. And it's just interesting to hear her perspective on the same time period, being around the same people. But again, the book's called Minor Characters, so pretty aptly named there. But I don't know, what would you say your favorite like book is right now?
Oh, right now. That's a good question. I just started a book called The Age of Soccer, which pretty much is just a historical encyclopedia on football, which is, always something I'm interested in. Big football fan. Real football, the one where we actually use your feet. People who are listening to this, by the way. And then my favorite book is Their Eyes Were Watching God. I actually read it once a year. Zora Neale Hurston is my, favorite author, writer. If you read my poetry book, you know this. So,
I said
yeah,
right now. I knew that, but yeah.
I'd say those two.
Any other rapid fire? Sorry, I keep
Yeah,
you.
no. When it's safe to do so, again, where are you going? Where are you traveling next?
Oh, I really want to get to New Zealand. Never been there before. I just feel like physically it's a beautiful place that I would love to go check out.
Yeah.
Well, that's a very long flight, very expensive flight. So that one's not going to be happening in a long time, but it's on the list.
Yeah, something to build towards. Oliver, I appreciate you, man.
Appreciate you, Fred. Thanks so much for everything and for putting out all this amazing content and for being an instrumental part of my life, man. So always a huge thanks and appreciation for that.
Yeah, thanks, man. Politics as usual.